right? Thanking and praising God, especially this time, for the way in which he helps us to refocus and reprioritize in this, I keep saying, relatively famous chapter. But the more you thumb through the Gospels, even just looking at subject headings and paragraph headings, the more you realize that a lot of these stories are relatively famous. And so the risk of sounding like a broken record in this chapter filled with relatively famous stories, let's call it never mind. Yeah, never mind. As it's going to start off with a question that really leads into all but the last section of the chapter. I'm going to say about 4, 5, maybe 6 different lessons that are going to come from one question and then one last question leading to the end of the chapter. But that question that starts the chapter off is in verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" At which point he's going to respond in my paraphrase, "Never mind who the greatest is." Why? Because you have a larger concern, and that concern is whether or not you're going to get in the first place. Starting off with verse 2, which is going to say, "And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, 'Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.'" Might as well finish off that first section in verse 4, which reads, "Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." But he's not going to stop there, because in verses 5 and 6, he's going to go ahead and talk about another potential stumbling block that will keep us out of the kingdom of heaven, that being a cause of stumbling to those he describes as little children who are trying to enter the kingdom of heaven, warning us against becoming stumbling blocks. He's going to go on in verses 7 through 9 to talk about the way in which the world is going to face temptations to sin, but woe to the one through whom temptation comes. Going back to a metaphor or a symbolism or imagery, whatever, that he uses back in the Sermon on the Mount, saying, for your own personal sake, if your body parts are causing you to sin, it's better for you to cut them off and go into heaven maimed than to go whole into hell. This time he is using that illustration in the context of not causing others to sin. Literally saying it's better for you to go into heaven maimed than to go into hell whole. But this time he's saying make sure that you understand in that same context any behavior patterns that we have that especially are an unnecessary cause of stumbling to those around us. Those are the things you need to really consider cutting off, because regardless of who the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is, that won't be your issue if you engage in behavior patterns that cause others to stumble in a way that prevent you from getting in the first place. Small caveat. He is not saying that you allow others like the Pharisees that he is that he is consistently having conflict with to manipulate your behaviors through their quirks and their beliefs about what the law should be. He's already fighting that battle. It's not about manipulation. It is about unnecessarily causing others to stumble. And if I ever offered a qualification for this being my opinion, I'm offering it right there. This is me paraphrasing, because I don't want my interpretation of the passage to itself become a cause of stumbling. But that seems to be the clear indication. The passage flat out says, whoever causes one of these little ones to sin. I have softened it by saying caused unnecessarily. Understanding that, that's my attempt to say that God shows mercy, but the clear indication, if I haven't said that already, is that this is not an area that we want to play around with. And in a culture that encourages us to prize our freedoms, it's really important to understand the number of times that the passages talk about sacrificing freedoms, especially those that are, I'm going to add the qualification again, that are an unnecessary cause of either provocation or temptation to sin. Why? Because as the next relatively famous illustration or section of this chapter is going to say, verses 10 through 14 are going to remind us of the way in which God views us as his sheep, specifically valuing each enough that if he has 100, he values one lost one enough to where he'd leave the 99 just to go chase down and save that one. And valuing the sheep that much, he is emphasizing how much he wants us not to be a cause of stumbling for one another, but rather to the degree we get, as we might say nowadays, in our casual language, to the degree we get sideways with one another. Verses 15 through 20 are going to have the famous passage about going to one another to reconcile, hopefully producing reconciliation. But in the event that we cannot produce reconciliation, the famous process through which we disfellowship in the event that we cannot agree, even with the help of the church. Going on to have Peter spark the final lesson, I guess, or the final way Christ will sum up this chapter in a parable by asking, okay, how often should I forgive my brother who sins against me? 7 times, that being a traditional number of completeness. Jesus is going to raise the standard saying, I don't say 7 times, but one translation in the ESV is going to say, but 70 times 7. Another translation, even just within the ESV, will be footnoted to say 77 times, leading him to finish up with an illustration by way of parable in verses 23 through the end of the chapter, talking about an unforgiving servant who had a master to whom he had a debt in terms of talents, which weigh out, I think each individual talent is footnoted as being roughly some multiple of a year's worth of salary for an employee. But this man owed thousands and thousands of talents, meaning years and years worth of labor to this man. He couldn't pay it. So the man was going to throw him into debtor's prison, I guess we call it, even though that's not necessarily a thing anymore. He's going to throw him into lockup because he couldn't pay his debts. He begged or pleaded with the man to show him mercy, to which the man responded, okay. So he shows him mercy. However, that freed servant goes out to find one of his fellow servants who owes him, when I did the calculations years ago, what seems to be a sizable sum. So he's not being petty. He's basically probably, is my estimation or paraphrase once again, under the shock of having been almost locked up, probably angry that he would at least have that little bit left, but he still is being petty to the degree that that little bit was still not going to pay his debt. And more importantly, when his fellow servant pleads with him for mercy, unlike the mercy he got, he decides to give none, at which point his fellow servants are so upset, they go and tell the master, who then snatches him back up, throws him into prison. And as Jesus concludes in verse 35, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. A super convicting passage in which a single word stands out to me because it appears twice in the passage. And I'm going to confess it may be because the passage is so convicting, I'm looking for an out or something to, as I tried to do earlier on in the chapter, something to soften the blow or the requirement of forgiving from the heart. But that word that stands out to me is that word pleaded, understanding that the unforgiving servant pleaded with his master for the debt that he owed in talents, and likewise his fellow servant pleaded with him in verse 32 to forgive the debt. And the thing that caught me about the way in which this passage both applies and is difficult to apply in these days is the degree to which the lack of humility that God calls us to in the beginning of the chapter even makes this an issue, because we live in a time now where we are encouraged, as I used to say, I haven't said it in a while, to pick up the mentality and often enough the outright phrase, I didn't do anything wrong. Understanding that the parable that God gives or Jesus gives at the end of this chapter talks about people who have pleaded for mercy. In between, a process by which a brother tries to reconcile with someone, or a member of Christ's body tries to reconcile with another member who has wronged them, seeking to reach an agreement that the wrong has actually been committed. That is the context for the final parable in this chapter, understanding that even before that reconciliation, God talks about our obligation not to engage in even our freedoms that unnecessarily, as I said, I qualified it with unnecessarily, but the passage just flat out says that cause one of these little ones to sin. He's going to start out saying that, but he's going to expand it out to any cause of temptation. leaving me to wonder that even though he gives us a broad warning that we have to forgive from the heart, I have to confess that as much as any chapter, this one leaves me kind of scratching my head regarding the way biblical forgiveness actually applies to those who won't humble themselves enough to ask for, much less plead for forgiveness, but rather seem to have conformed themselves, even within the church, to a culture that tells them they're entitled to be petty, provocative, and free to say just about whatever they want to whoever they want, whenever they want. And maybe even more, quietly, low key, doing whatever they want, regardless of how it harms others.